All right, so thank you, Randy, and thank you to the Mershon Center for inviting me to come give this talk. I admit, so initially I got this invitation, like, hey, will you come to this conference on grand strategy and talk about something about public opinion or nationalism? And I was like, grand strategy, aha. I've got this great paper with someone who cares a lot about grand strategy, and that's my colleague, Steve Brooks. And I think it'll be a really good fit for this conference. And in fact, I've become increasingly persuaded of that, and I'm taking it as a personal vote of confidence that you put me in the last slide, just knowing how well it would tie everything together. So I'm going to present this paper called What's Fair in International Politics, Equity, Equality, and Foreign Policy Attitudes. Before I even get started, I want to note that this is co-authored with a couple of amazing people, including Josh Kurtzer, my former OSU colleague, and again, former Mershon Center affiliate and fan, as well as two Dartmouth colleagues, Deb Brooks and Steve Brooks. Steve Brooks, well known for supporting all of the things that we find members of the public don't actually care about in this particular paper. So now let's go ahead and get started. So over the past few days, we've heard a lot from experts about American grand strategy. What are the costs and the risks of different approaches from Bill and Hal? Whether we should expect stability or instability from David and Dan. And then today we had all these different papers on different elements of public opinion towards American foreign policy from, with respect to conscription from Lindsay and Line from Sarah and norms and taboos from Chris. And I think this project can sort of bring some of this together because a core part of the debate over grand strategy and indeed foreign policy in the Trump administration pertains to just how involved the US should be in the world. And this is sort of one of the dynamics that we're going to try and get at in this particular paper. I should also note before I dig into the substance of this paper that we're starting from a premise that we have, my co-authors and others have outlined in several other papers in the past, which is that Americans don't know a whole lot about foreign policy. And that doesn't really matter because what they do know is right from wrong. And they have these innate intuitions about what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And they can draw on these to form attitudes about elements of foreign policy. And so we're starting from that assumption. And I think it's a fair and empirically validated assumption. And I think you could even see it over the last couple of days among non-regular members of the public. Right? We have ideas about what's right and wrong, and we use those to guide our assumptions about what's good in foreign policy. Okay, so let's get into some of the substance of this. I want to start by just throwing some data at you. I pulled this off of the internet a couple of days ago. And this is just showing you something that perhaps some people don't believe is intuitively true, but Americans really like NATO. And they've really liked NATO for a really long time. And this is actually something that has held stable over the years and well into the Trump administration. And you can ask even other specific questions about NATO, about whether we should defend allies and things like that. You get really high levels of support. So here it's showing you that even into 2019, 77% of members of the American public think that the NATO alliance should be maintained. And my colleague Steve Brooks looks at this and he's like, this is great. But what they don't like is the way that defense spending is distributed within the NATO alliance. And specifically, when Reuters Ipsos asked this question of Americans in 2018, they said, look, if America's NATO allies don't spend more on defense, the United States should not be required to uphold commitments in the organization's treaty and defend those countries from attack. This is like nightmare scenario for NATO, right? If they don't start increasing their spending, NATO doesn't have to do anything to defend them. Goodbye, Latvia, goodbye, Estonia. And Americans are like really amenable to this argument. And it's true across different partisan identifications. So you can see the percentage of Americans who agree with this sentiment is quite high. And again, it's even above, almost 40% among Democrats, higher among Republicans in the red. And the percentage of Americans who disagree with this sentiment is actually quite low. There's quite a few who fall into this don't know category. In other words, there's something that doesn't feel right to them about NATO. Now, what's that thing that doesn't feel right about NATO? Well, like the president says, it's very unfair. All right, and this is something that the Trump administration has repeated both on the campaign trail and thereafter, that there's something about this distribution of resources that is simply unfair to the United States, and it ought to be corrected. Now, this is interesting to us for a couple of different reasons. The first is that we can characterize a lot of potential fair foreign policy issues as burden sharing violations, as things that sort of fall into this general category of times when the US does a whole lot to bring some benefit that actually has more benefits for partners, allies, or even other countries in the world than it brings directly to the United States and to Americans. And so there's this whole class of foreign policy issues. It's unfair that the US bears responsibility for intervening in humanitarian crises that are far from its borders. It's unfair that in the Kyoto Protocol, the US had to cut their emissions while nobody else did. And this is a huge class of issues that, frankly, public opinion scholars haven't paid a whole lot of attention to, even though they're actually quite prominent when we think about US foreign policy and some of the dilemmas that policymakers face. Second, when we talk about fairness in foreign policy, and this is a bit of inside baseball, but if you read literature on fairness in foreign policy, we tend to think of it as this very pro-social, pro-cooperation value. In other words, when people care a lot about things being fair, they want more cooperation. They want international institutions. They want to work with the UN. They want to provide more food aid and foreign aid to countries abroad. And yet here's a situation where an objection on the basis of fairness is actually making Americans want to pull back, to stop cooperating with their allies and not come to their defense. Finally, the third thing that we think is really interesting about this particular dilemma is that this isn't about Trump and this isn't about Republicans. Barack Obama said the exact same thing. This is something that he conveyed to David Cameron back during his administration, which is free riders aggravate me. You have to pay your fair share. Right? And he specifically was calling out NATO allies for not spending enough on defense as the treaty calls for. And so this is not a uniquely conservative issue. This is actually something that crosses party lines. And again, this is going to be really important when we think about the broader public foundations for American grand strategy, or the way in which policymakers can sell their strategies to members of the public. Okay, so this is what we think is interesting. We've got this class of issues that all sort of implicate the same type of dynamic, and we've got cross-partisan agreement that there's something wrong with these issues, and specifically that they're unfair. I won't go over this because if you want to read the literature on fairness in foreign policy, you have a whole bunch of citations in my paper. But again, suffice to say that this is not something that is like a new thing that we're bringing into the literature, this idea about fairness. But again, when we've talked about fairness in the past, it always tends to be on this notion of sort of pro-cooperation. So fairness helps peace negotiations. Fairness helps diplomacy. For example, people who are more pro-social, who are more generous in making offers, are more likely to come to an agreement when they're engaging in diplomatic negotiations. It's this very cooperative, touchy-feely kind of thing. And so we have all this evidence that fairness matters. But this all relies on this one assumption, that fairness is a unidimensional construct. In other words, that fair is fair. And that all of us have the same understanding of what constitutes a fair foreign policy or a fair arrangement when it comes to some of these alliance issues or burden sharing violations. But this is simply wrong. Fairness carries multiple meanings based on different moral principles. In other words, fair is not fair. And if we lump them all together as this one thing, we're going to miss a lot of what's important when it comes to understanding how people evaluate some of these foreign policy issues. So what's fair to me might not be fair to Randy, and what's fair to Randy might not be fair to Lindsay, right? We might all have a very different idea in our mind of what constitutes a fair arrangement in foreign policy. And I'll talk about some specific examples in a moment, and some of those that sort of animated this particular research. So the first way to understand fairness is on a principle of equality. Now, equality implies a preoccupation with outcomes. Something is fair if everyone achieves the same end state. So in behavioral economic games, for example, we have just decades worth of research showing that in something like an ultimatum game where one person is making an offer and somebody else receives that offer and either accepts it, getting some money, or rejects it, losing it for both of them, people will sacrifice their own material gains if you get too far away from a 50-50 split. Like, we want a 50-50 split because that's fair. And if we don't get a 50-50 split, fine, we'll forego everything that we could have otherwise gotten. people really center on this notion of equality of outcomes. And we see, again, this dynamic in international relations research. So Gottfried and Traeger have this excellent paper on crisis bargaining, where they show that members of the public actually want the US to engage in negotiations that lead to a 50-50 territorial split with an adversary. That they're happier with that kind of arrangement, even compared to arrangements where the US actually gets more. And so we can think about this in a number of different ways. So in American politics, concerns about equality tend to be associated with things like increased support for welfare. And this makes sense when you think about it in this context, right? The goal of welfare policies is to make everyone better off. There's a broad benefit, and the goal of those is to provide equal outcomes in the long run. When we talk about NATO funding or other efforts to engage in global cooperation, you could make a case on the basis of equality. The US is spending a lot or contributing more to human rights operations or improving the global environment. And this advances a cause for everyone. It leads to these broader, more equal outcomes. It's a little bit more tenuous. On that basis, you could argue that it's actually quite fair that wealthy actors spend a little more, because again, the goal is to get to the outcomes. We don't really care about what people are bringing to the table. By contrast, we can also think about fairness as based on a principle of equity. And this is distinct from equality because we're focused now on the ratio between the inputs and outputs, not just on the outputs. And here, the basic idea is that actors who contribute more should have a larger share of a common resource. So if I work harder than somebody, then I should get paid more, right? That's simply how these types of things should work. If you put in more time and energy on a co-authored paper, you get to put your name at the front, right? This is an equitable arrangement whereby people get rewarded in proportion to the effort that they put forth. People who support welfare work requirements, for example, often invoke concerns about equity. If you're going to get something from the government, you ought to do some work. You ought to pay some effort in order to receive those benefits. Again, here we're turning our attention to those inputs. And we argue, and we'll unpack this a little bit more, that these objections to things like free riding and alliances and violations of burden sharing depend primarily on this equity-based principle. If the US bears most of the deterrent responsibility and pays most of the costs in terms of spending more money on defense than their allies, but their partners over in Eastern Europe actually get the biggest direct benefit, then this arrangement is simply unfair. So you've got to equalize it somehow. You can't really equalize the benefits. There's no way you can change NATO to make it so that the US is benefiting directly more than Estonia and Latvia, but you can equalize the inputs by, again, encouraging people to pay more in. So the fairest thing to do there on a principle of equity would be to ensure that all partners pay similar costs. So again, these are two distinct faces of fairness, and that is basically our first hypothesis here, which is simply that fairness has two faces, and we can differentiate empirically between equity and equality. And so if we dig into the types of situations that actually evoke these types of fairness concerns, we should be able to uncover these two distinct dimensions that underlie this moral impulse. Now you might be sitting there, I won't call out anyone in particular, but by saying like, who cares? Sure, there's two different types of fairness. What difference does this make to my life? Well, we think it's important for a couple of reasons. First, we simply don't know which principle dominates in the way that people think about foreign policy issues, or if in fact, these principles actually work at cross purposes. And that's really interesting, again, because we've got this whole body of literature, some of which is my fault, saying that fairness is this pro-social, pro-cooperation moral impulse. Second, and this is what Randy is just gonna love, right? Research in psychology and American politics tells us that we should actually expect predictable differences between which type of fairness people value, depending on their partisan identification and ideological orientation. Namely, liberals and Democrats love equality. And again, equality is like the only thing that IR scholars are talking about. Conservatives and Republicans don't care that much about equality. They do care about fairness, but they draw on a different principle. And so again, there's this host of literature showing us that we should expect these differences in how people are interpreting fairness. And yet when we measure fairness on a survey, we just ask people like, hey, do you think justice is important or that people should be treated fairly? it's hard to know what those means if people are drawing on different principles and defining those things in different ways. And third, and most importantly for this group, we think that this distinction has important consequences for how we understand the moral foundations of foreign policy attitudes. In particular, we expect that concerns about equity underlie the reflexive opposition that many Americans have to burden sharing problems in foreign policy. And that because we've been thinking about fairness in terms of equality and pro-cooperation, we've been missing this really important dynamic. And so even when US involvement will produce big, important global benefits, we expect that equity is going to cause people to sort of move away from that or see the particular policy as problematic for the US. They'll object to it on the basis of equity. This paper is also a little bit, is about more than just burden sharing. And so we also examine a couple of other bigger, more standard foreign policy issues drawing across a couple of different dimensions. And we make the argument that, in fact, sometimes these two dimensions of fairness can push against each other. Namely, we would expect equality to be associated with the support for policies that maximize jointly enjoyed gains. In other words, policies that are pushing towards positive outcomes, equal outcomes distributed across everybody, something like a mutual arms reduction. Whereas equity should have nothing to do with that. They don't care about that. Whereas we expect equity to be associated with levels of support, or specifically opposition, to policies that threaten relative gains, right? So people who value equity should be especially attentive to issues like tariffs, right, which they are going to focus on sort of the relative gains to be made from those, rather than the broader global benefits that we might gain from, for example, a free trade system globally speaking. Okay, so we're interested in how these two things might push in opposite directions. Okay, so how do we study this? Well, we actually studied this in 2014, which is interesting because, again, all of these results are going to predate the Trump administration and their sort of vocal opposition to NATO and vocal opposition to these burden sharing issues. And we think that's important for understanding just how sort of core these ideas are. So in 2014, we have a survey of 1,000 Americans collected to match census quotas on a number of different things. It's not a probability-based sample, but we do weight it and find similar results. And we have two goals. The first goal is just to construct these latent scales to measure equity and equality without asking people things like, do you think justice is important? And to evaluate the relationship between equity, equality, and foreign policy attitudes. So for goal number one, we decide to measure fairness attitudes by asking people to evaluate the degree to which a number of scenarios feel morally wrong to them. Okay, and so we ask them about several different scenarios, and each of these scenarios sort of implicates a different type of violation. The first three, which are sort of in black so you can see them and outlined by this green box, represent equity violations, but not equality violations. The individuals in each of these vignettes, the two students and the runners that are taking shortcuts in various ways, are basically all getting something for nothing, right? They're violating this principle of equity by not contributing the same to getting some particular result. Students not doing their own work, instead they're simply copying it. A runner's taking a shortcut and moving up in the place despite not having done the same work as others. And so these are all distinct equity violations, but they don't really stymie equality in any way. We don't really care about equality of outcomes on homework assignments or a race course. In fact, these all draw specifically on these notions of inputs versus outputs. These bottom two represent equality violations. The raise is given to a worker when another worker needs it more, or an employee earns a lot of money while another earns very little. These violate equality. The employees clearly do not achieve equivalent end states, but they're perfectly fair from the perspective of equity, right? It's completely reasonable that some employees might earn different amounts of money, maybe based on merit, maybe based on how hard they work, how many hours they worked, etc. And so we think those are going to be distinctly the type of things that evoke equity concerns. These two in the middle that are sort of outlined with both colors, two brothers win a lottery with a ticket they bought together, but the earnings aren't divided equally. And some little girl takes all of the Halloween candy from a bowl, leaving none for the others. These two actually draw a little bit on both principles. They represent both equality and equity violations, right? On one hand, the two brothers both put in the same amount of money. Therefore, based on equity, they should both get out the same in return. There's clearly a violation there. But at the same time, it's not divided equally, so they're not achieving a similar end state. And so it's sort of picking up on equality as well. And the same is true of the girl who absconded with all the candy. She clearly didn't put any candy into that bowl, so it's not unfair that she would take it all out. And it is obviously stopping any equal distribution for any of the other kids at this imaginary Halloween party. Okay, so we ask people these questions, and we want to form two independent scales. So we do what people do in quantitative data, and we run a factor analysis. And what we find is that, in fact, these do form two distinct and distinguishable dimensions. So you can see here, the three that we identified as primarily equity violations are clearly equity violations. They're all loading together, and they're not doing anything on that equality scale. The two we identified as equality violations are loading together just on that scale. They're not really loading together with equity. And those two that were in the middle sort of interestingly seem to be primarily loading on the equity scale, which is how we then treat them in our analysis. And we think that's interesting because it basically suggests that when two principles are salient, members of the public in our sample are focusing mostly on the equity part of it. That's the part that seems to matter more to them, and so they bring it together with those other equity violations. Okay, so I'm sure this was fascinating for everyone who is as passionate about measurement as I am. But I want to show you some substantive things so that you have other interesting things to look at. The first thing that's substantively interesting is shown in these plots. These are just showing you the density of people's scores on each of these two dimensions, with equality in purple and equity in that sort of green color. And you should notice two things. Number one, the purple is much higher for Democrats and liberals. We see the sort of lump in this particular distribution skewed more towards the right, more towards the stronger concerns about equality. Whereas Republicans and conservatives, we see this left skew, whereby people just are scoring much lower on the equality scale. They don't care that much about these equality violations. It's just not important. They don't think it's morally wrong when people don't achieve the same end states. Liberals and Democrats do. And so there is this clear and substantively and statistically significant difference between those two. On the other hand, you should also notice that everyone values equity. We find no statistical differences between the distributions of equity across liberals, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives. You see this incredibly right-skewed distribution for all of our different demographic subgroups. In other words, fairness as equity matters to everyone, which again is going to be really interesting when we think about the types of arguments and types of grand strategies that might resonate with members of the public. Okay, so fairness has two faces. None of this has anything to do with foreign policy, but this does. So then we ask people to evaluate a bunch of burden sharing problems. And we designed these to span a couple of different issue areas. Here's a familiar one that has to do with defense budgets. And so we tell them, like, how much is it a problem that countries like Germany, Canada, and Japan don't devote a lot of money to their own defense, and instead basically just rely on the fact that the United States does in fact spend a lot of money on defense. We ask them similar scenarios with respect to foreign aid. So here the idea is America's Western allies don't give a lot of money to foreign aid for women and children in the Middle East because, again, the US can simply take care of it. The US provides all of the needed troops and money for a peacekeeping mission while other countries don't contribute anything. Again, there's this clear sort of equity violation happening there, even though the sort of long-term benefits are good for everyone. And finally, we ask them about an environmental issue. So here the US provides all of the needed resources and personnel for cleaning up toxic waste contamination. And again, other countries don't do anything at all. So what do we find when we regress those dependent variables on our equity and equality scales? We find that equity is clearly the foundation for people's positions on all of those burden sharing scenarios. What we're showing you here is simply the coefficient. Everything is rescaled from 0 to 1, so you can interpret this as an effect size. And what you see is this large positive effect of equity concerns on each one of these dependent variables. This is, you can interpret that as saying people who care more about equity are more likely to say it is a problem that these defense budgets are not the same across the board. What's also interesting is that equality has almost no bearing on people's judgments of these burden sharing situations. So when we treat fairness as simply focused on equality, and again, this sort of pro-social notion, we're not going to be able to understand why people object to these burden sharing violations. These are all depending on this principle of equity. That coefficient on equality is almost never statistically significant. It's only is with respect to the defense budgets. And in case, again, for the methodologists in the room, this is not just covering for any of these standard foreign policy orientations that we also measure. Equity in particular matters, and it has a larger effect even over and above and beyond people's general isolationist impulse or orientations towards militarism or cooperative internationalism. Again, you see that green coefficient is much larger than everything else, and everything's on the same 0 to 1 scale. Okay, I have one more set of results, and then I will wrap it up so we can have a thrilling discussion. Finally, we asked people about a couple of different foreign policies, 3 in particular, and this is where we're really going to show how important it is that these two things push against each other. So on the one hand, we asked them if they would support a politician who supports an arms control treaty that would reduce both the US and Russian nuclear arsenals. Right? Equality implies that they should support it, but it really doesn't tell us anything about proportionality, so equity probably shouldn't play a role. Then we asked them about decreasing limits on the imports of foreign-made products and signing more free trade agreements, free trade. And again, we think equality should imply support for this type of policy. Free trade levels the playing field overall by helping developed economies or helping developing economies. But equity implies opposition, right? We shouldn't be sort of hamstringing our own economy in order to help others. We should help, the U.S. manufacturing industry rather than reducing these tariffs. And finally, we asked people about whether or not we should increase military spending to allow the U.S. to better solve international problems. And the end of that is particularly important, right? This isn't increase military spending to help our own defense. This is like increase military spending to engage in more global activism and do all the things that we've identified as burden sharing issues. And we think that equity should imply opposition to such a measure. And again, this is a big problem when we think about the sort of long-term grand strategies related to like the debate between deep engagement and restraint. And here, again, what we're seeing is the fact that equity and equality matter, but they sometimes matter in different ways. And so in particular on the free trade and military spending dependent variables, we see that equity increases support for those policies, whereas, oh, I think those labels might be wrong. These labels are wrong. Equality increases support for military spending to go out and solve global problems, whereas equity decreases support. So just flip those around in your mind. And this is what happens when I just try to add colors to plots. And we see something similar with respect to free trade. Again, equality increases support for free trade, whereas equity decreases support for free trade. In other words, if all you're doing is trying to justify one of these policies on the basis of fairness, you could be pushing people in different directions because you can justify both support and opposition on the basis of fairness. And so you're going to want to be a little bit more specific. Okay, so what do I want to leave you with? The number one thing is that fairness is multidimensional. If we just ask people whether or not they care about justice, we're going to obscure important heterogeneity. Standard partisan and ideological lines divide how much Americans value equality in wages and in global politics, but they mostly agree, like Donald Trump and Barack Obama, that equity violations are simply unfair. We also find it interesting that equity concerns may provide a moral foundation for something like isolationism, which to this point has largely been considered sort of an amoral response to other structural and economic constraints. And more importantly, and what I think will make an interesting discussion topic, is this idea that the public preoccupation with equity poses a potential barrier to a US foreign policy and grand strategy of something like deep engagement, which would horrify my co-author Steve Brooks. Right? Opponents of deep engagement might actually be able to draw a broad swath of support for alternatives to such policies by simply casting the costs of doing this as unfair to America and unfair to Americans. So that is where I want to leave you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hence Trump. Yeah, great. I can't wait to get at it. Chris, you're up.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I absolutely love this paper. And it's really cool. It's a really great example of how to do very contemporary political psych work in IR that's very, very much still directly focused with answering some of the things that we think are really important to try and figure out, that have been puzzling, especially in regards to public opinion about foreign policy, which maybe has some of the most enduring unresolved debates, right? If you could go back to like Walter Lippmann in the 20s, there's still questions that we have not answered, which I think is always a good thing to throw in a foreign policy opinion frame. I think people overlook just how weird it is that we still have not worked a lot of this stuff out. So I'll try and hit on a lot of the points you requested. I do want to say right off the bat, though, the experimental design here is just really, really strong. It's original, it's creative, it's pretty exhaustive. You bring in a lot of different things. You're not just controlling for, things we might think we need to control for. You're giving us real insight into, well, in our complex multi-causal world, how does this thing matter stacked up against all these other things we might think might matter, like aptitude toward cooperative internationalism, isolationism. Also, this allows you to get this really cool finding, which I actually I want to point out I think is a little too buried here. It seemed really fascinating to me. So the shift from the minimum to maximum equity is associated with a 0.37 unit increase. It's twice the effect size of isolationism, right? That to me is kind of crazy. That someone thinking isolationism is good and having a coherent view on that about guiding foreign policy is half as effective at shifting opinions as this equity frame. If I'm interpreting that correctly, that seems like a pretty significant finding. And you mentioned it in the talk, but it seems a little buried in the paper to me. I also wanted to point to the strength of the vignette metric. I think this is really important from a political psych perspective, that we're trying to move things out of the realm of I'm asking an abstract question about what I think in my mind fairness or equality is about. I'm giving real world situations that people are encountering and having reactions to, and this is the construct validity is just so much stronger here. And I also think this is an example in political psych. A lot of what we tend to do is to find cool stuff from psychology and stab it into foreign policy or IR in some way. This is a great example of how you actually really be able to take something from political science that includes the political context. It can even then go back into psych literature and psych approaches. Like the conversation does not just have to go one way. Certain contexts, certain concepts are inherently political and politicized, and at least in any of the ways that we expect humans to experience reality. So I think there's useful information flow that can go the other way too. The one thing I'll note here, though, I do wonder, going back to the 7 different vignettes here, I wonder if there's also a role being played by perceived malfeasance. Because yes, the first 5 are loading on equity, but not the last 2, but they're also loading on explicit wrongdoing and bad faith action, right? Which, certainly that can produce that, that produces inequity, but it's not necessary to have a situation that's characterized by inequity. and indeed, right, we do find really different effects for the scenarios that are not that don't involve explicit wrongdoing. So I think that's something potentially we're looking at. More to say about that, but I'll try and skip over that for the comments portion. So you asked when we corresponded before the discussion, you asked for particular attention to connections to other literature, conceptual clarity, looking at analysis and policy implications, which seemed like the most interesting things to look for. I'll try and touch on all those real quick and then open it up. Connections to other literature, oddly, the first thing that I thought of here was actually Carl Schmitt, for reasons that, bear with me a little bit here, but for reasons that actually go to what I was just talking about. So you have this great point that I think it's the punchy line of the article, that fairness is not inherently pro-social. So yeah, that split, you seem to be telling us the story is governed by equity versus equality conceptions of fairness. But it seems to me that where that difference is sort of most saliently activated is in what Schmitt thinks of as the concept of the political, where you have competition between groups. There's at least a potential specter of violence, right? That is the political context that really activates this distinction. And yeah, I think that further underscores again why there's utility in bringing in the political to simply sort of psychological approaches. But that was the thing that struck me. I think the connections to all the other political psych literature, especially the moral foundation stuff, are done very well and exhaustively in the lit group. Nothing more to say on that. In terms of clarity, the one thing that I'll point out, there seems to be a little bit of haziness around the equity, equality, not in how they differ from each other, which I think is really well explained, but in how they load downstream to fairness. And to be fair, I actually think this is mostly just picking up on, there's a lot of murkiness in the way that Haidt talks about this stuff, and it's notably changed over time, as I'm sure, I assume you're much more familiar with this literature than I am. I find this particular point with Haidt to be very confusing. And I went and tracked down a bunch of passages that, and put them in there. But it seems to me that what the paper is saying is that equity matters to both liberals and conservatives, equality matters to liberals, and equity matters much more to conservatives than to liberals.
Well, so previous research has made that claim. We do not find evidence for that. We find that equity matters pretty equally across both groups.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah. So, yes. Oh, okay. No, I reversed I read that wrong. I think maybe just sort of front loading a little bit. Here's what the book on equity versus equality mattering to fairness and the conservative liberal split is. Here's where we found something a little different. I think you can sort of get into the weeds there a little bit. But again, right, you're dealing with something that has actually changed over time and that Haidt is not super clear on. And also you're dealing with the fact that the past 10 years of moral foundations research has often used like the old moral foundations questionnaire before they fixed this to do all their experiments. So it's super confusing. Yeah, so to the analysis, good stuff. So one of the things that struck out to me here, it seems that one of the key claims of this article really gets at this idea of sort of, folk narratives in foreign policy opinion formation that I know Josh has done a lot of work on, that, members of the public know a lot about a foreign policy issue, so they look to something that they understand in their personal life, their daily life, and they equate that to their foreign policy opinion. They build it up from that. And I think there's, absolutely something to that. It seems to me, though, potentially that there actually might be two subtly different potential mechanisms here. So on one of them might be sort of, I have a visceral sort of almost, Haidt moral foundation purity reaction to iniquity, right? That when situations aren't equitable, it feels viscerally wrong to me. And so when I see that, either in my personal life or in foreign policy. I just, oh, that's bad. I don't like that. It makes me think of the TED Talk with the monkey getting the grape or the cucumber. If you're familiar, where he just, you know, doesn't even want the cucumber now, he just throws it back at the researcher because the other monkey gets the grape. But there could also be a sort of a different mechanism where, you know, you don't know a lot about the foreign policy issue, so you're reaching toward something you do understand, like your narratives about the importance of equity, to give you information to evaluate this question as best you are able to evaluate it. And that does seem importantly different to me, because if people are, you know, if they're trying to think, oh, well, I think the world would be better, it'd be better for US interests if the US didn't bear such a high burden, which I think the first two, especially in the foreign policy scenarios, imply, right? They say, you know, they seem to imply, if we didn't pay all this money, those other countries would step up and pay their fair share. That's sort of a different process than I'm just going to throw the cucumber at you because I really don't like this. Well, so like, for instance, just to make this a little clearer, and then I'll wrap it up. If you don't have a very firm idea of what sort of good is obtained for US interests by NATO membership, right? Which I think it'd be safe to say the average member of the public could not articulate that particularly well. So all you're really evaluating there potentially might be, is equity good? And at that point, it becomes a tautology, right? At least for the first two frames. Because I don't really know anything about this particular issue. But you know, what would happen if we could correct for that? If you know, do equity concerns override wanting to obtain some policy good? Or is this just a shortcut to tell us more information about things that we don't know a ton about? That brings me to the last thing, which is the policy implications. And that question in particular seems to be pretty important for policy implications, right? Because the upshot is, well, that would change how you would want to try and sell policies that might come off as not equitable. I mean, you know, you've got a great policy implication that, boy, you know, is there fertile ground to be mined here to stoke public reaction against things? And perhaps indeed we found there was some after 2014. But if we think that, depending on which of those two mechanisms we think is going on, you know, if it's just that it rankles people because they don't like anything that isn't equitable, well, if you're trying to sell something like, we need to commit to NATO spending, disproportionate spending anyway, you're just going to have to try and lie about it, right? Or you're going to have to frame it differently, right? Whereas if you think that, you know, actually you can override this if you explain to people that the good you get is worth it. Maybe you have to put that good in a term in a, you know, a moral foundation that they also think, right? But if you could sell that, well, then you could just say, look, but you know, yeah, we're paying more than our fair share, but we're getting so much good out of it, and that would work. But whether or not that works really turns on which of those two paths it's taking. I would think, and you know, I don't know if there's a way to get at it from here, but it seems to be a very interesting question. So I'll stop there. I talk too long anyway, but yeah, awesome paper. This was really great. Had a great time reading this.
Okay, we have questions. Yeah, I just want to say something to start. I know I'm going to clean up. Just like my early work as a grad student, I worked with Debbie Larson, and I was always writing papers on reciprocity. That's all I did. I wrote, you know, paper after paper. And so the whole tit for tat reciprocity was always, Debbie Larson was talking about this too, like, you know, what is fair? What is, how do you know? You know, what is reciprocity? It's all about fair exchange, right? So I noticed when I looked at your paper, I did the reciprocity check. There was no mention of reciprocity or the whole literature on that. And it's so incredibly relevant. And so I did put down this thing for your info. The logic we talked is entirely consistent with Evelyn Spire Colbert's Retaliation in International Law from 1948, which is a fantastic book, because what they're doing over time, she's looking at like, what is retaliation over time? Well, it changes. Like Hammurabi, you know, eye for an eye. Then it becomes 2 eyes for an eye. Then it's something else, you know, like what we think is fair. What is a reprisal? What is retaliation? What is fair exchange? So that's really kind of what you're talking about in this paper, isn't it? So I don't want you to like recreate the wheel or miss an entire audience, you know, about this, because there's a lot written on it. I mean, I think what you did is great, but I just feel like fairness, equity, equality, all this is all about, you know, it seems to me reciprocity. You say, I want to relate it to international relations. Well, think about reciprocity in international relations. We had that whole conversation in the 80s about it. All that, you know, game theory, tit for tat. Bill Wolforth, you're up then, Sarah. I just screwed up, but don't worry. It's not, yeah, you'll get in. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, yeah, so Katie's got a lot there, but in my case, it won't really add anything to her list, because I'm going to just kind of reiterate what Chris said towards the end, but I just want to reiterate because it was exactly my same reaction, which is I love the paper, an incredible presentation, just love the presentation. That's the question I had. In the ultimatum game sets up an absolutely clear, unambiguous trade-off between fairness and self-interest maximizing. And I'm just not 100% sure that your experiments do that for the reasons that Chris stated. And I just wanted to make that, I just want to reiterate what he said. Namely, they may conflate fairness with the American national interest unless the prompt makes it clear that it is in fact in the US interest to support NATO, even if it's unfair. So my take on NATO fairness has always been, I debate Darryl Press. He's supposed to be this big realist. You know, he's supposed to be Mr. Cost Benefit. But when he's in front of an audience, he's going on and on about fairness, not because he himself gives a shit about fairness, but because he knows it's going to resonate with the audience. Whereas I respond saying, hey, audience, don't worry about the stuff that my dear colleague Darryl was just talking about. Just ask yourself, do you want allies or not? I mean, is it in your interest to pay a little bit extra, more than they're paying, and set aside your childish concerns about fairness? So anyway, is Chris and I wrong that this is not captured clearly? And if we're right that it isn't captured clearly, is there a way to capture this clearly?
We're getting real now.
Can I just jump in to answer?
Yes.
I think this is incredibly important. I should add that, like, perhaps unsurprisingly, part of the genesis of this project is Steve's expressing similar sentiment to Bill, which is like, the US gets enormous benefits from NATO that far outweigh any costs that we're spending. And so in his mind, it's perfectly proportionate that we pay a little bit more, right? And so for him, it's like, it's not an equity violation. It's perfectly fair because the benefits are so tremendous. And I think this is some of the dynamic you're capturing. I think our surveys do not capture that. I think what we're trying to demonstrate is simply that when people see these types of situations, their automatic reaction is going to be just one of an equity-based aversion. And they're going to say like, I'm not comfortable with this situation. And they're not going to start thinking down the game tree to the strategic benefits. Now, the way to get at this would be to do an experiment in which we sort of actually gave people more information, or gave people sort of a point counterpoint about somebody saying like, well, you know, some people make the argument that in fact the benefits are proportionate to the costs in this scenario, or something, you know, less stylized than that, to see whether or not it would, like Chris said, whether the moral principle would sort of override these concerns. My hunch is that most of the time the values are going to win out, and that people aren't going to buy that, mostly because I think people have a hard time sort of conceptualizing these long run interests, or interests that aren't sort of like, the benefit to Latvia and Estonia is obvious and concrete, and we can put our finger on it. The benefit to the US is much more murky. And so people are going to have a harder time really seeing that as a benefit that outweighs the relative costs that they're paying. But that is my hunch. That's not, I don't have data to back that up. So it would be very much worth doing. But I think it's an important question.
Could I very quickly on that? Actually, I was curious. So the 4 different foreign policy scenarios, it seems to me that what really distinguishes them is the first two directly imply a counterfactual where if we didn't pay as much, someone else would pay more, and the second two do not do that. You know, perhaps the default way to read those would be, well, if we didn't do this, nobody would. Although it's not made, you know, that's not the point of the setup, right? But I wonder if the data you do have might have some splitting in that way that actually could give you some insight into the hunch that you just voiced. Maybe.
Interesting.
Sarah, go
I just
ahead.
had a really quick point. Well, first, I wanted to thank the people who sent me private comments earlier with suggestions for my talk. I meant to do that before the break and just forgot, so thank you for that. But also, just as a real quick suggestion, you wanted like other literature that talks about fairness in IR. I've done some papers on territorial disputes with Paul Huth and Ben Apple, and we talk about how international law helps provide these focal points that once the focal point is identified, anything that deviates from that focal point is seen as unfair, and so it gives the legally advantaged party an advantage. So
Awesome.
I just wanted to throw that out there. But.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Let's get Rick Herman, and he's been here for 2 days, and he's been so quiet. So let's.
I've really enjoyed though every paper. I've listened to most all of them, and it's been a great conference. So thanks for letting me have a comment or two. Katie, I liked your paper a lot. I have two questions. I wonder whether Americans would be as committed to equity when it required the US to pay more. In other words, you know, in Europe, it's very common to think about NATO or as sort of or the Americans as a very rich uncle who decides which restaurant to go, decides everything to order, picks the most expensive things on the menu, and then decides to split the bill and insists everybody else pay an equal share. And there's no equity in decision-making within NATO. So why would you expect equity in outcomes? So I guess what I'm wondering, equity is a big concept that implies sort of a similar control over everything. So there'd be a case where you could reframe this experiment and ask, you know, point out the inequity in decision-making and then ask if they think that's fair. Or maybe in humanitarian issues, the United States spends a rather small proportion of its GDP on foreign assistance compared to any of the Norwegian, the North European countries. So maybe you could see how much more they'd like, but in each of your cases was already framed as sort of Americans paying more and would want to pay less. And then the second question, and then I'll be quiet again. Does it matter who the relationship involves? So in yours, they're all context neutral. You don't name who the other is except NATO and tell the Americans that we're getting a bad deal out of that. But what if the relationship was an arms control deal with Iran or with North Korea or even with China? I wonder then whether the negative sentiment toward the foe would affect or mediate somehow the commitment to equity, or whether then they'd say, well, we can take a better deal here, as opposed to a friend. Let's say the deal was not with Iran, but with Saudi Arabia. And whether now, as you start to name real others where there's sentiment felt toward them or trust for them, whether equity would then start to move around a little bit. So again, thank you for a great paper. Thank all of you for a great set of papers. It's been an interesting couple of days. I'll be quiet now.
No need to be.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, thanks so much, Rick, for coming and for your comments. Like Lindsay, I'm lucky enough to have two of my OSU advisors here in this room. I find that to be just absolutely delightful because I miss you all terribly. These are really great questions, and particularly the first one, I think is just really tricky, right? So this is the question of like, would people be willing to sacrifice the US material interest in order for the US to do something that's more fair? And on one hand, there's sort of some empirical basis to suggest that they might, right? So like in the ultimatum game experiments, even the people making the offer tend to go much closer to 50-50 than they really ought to. And they do this even in dictator games, right? They're much less generous than they should be, given that they have all of the decision-making authority. They have this like drive towards some kind of fair distribution. And so there's some reason to believe that. Similarly, the Gottfried and Traeger piece finds this thing whereby people are more likely to sort of approve of these agreements when they perceive them to be fair, even though it's the US dealing with like a territorial dispute with Russia. That said, like, I'm not like totally convinced that that's what we'd see, and I think this is absolutely something worth testing, because I really do think that that's, especially when you bring up this point about foreign aid, right? Like the US gives, you know, tremendously less as a percentage compared to some Nordic countries and things like that. And you could make an argument that that is unfair, it's inequitable. And you could make similar arguments with respect to the environment, like the US really ought to pay more costs than some of these other countries. So that's great. As far as whether it matters who the relationship is with, expect something similar with like friends or foes. Yeah, it's interesting because we do find that scenario where we're asking people about an arms control agreement with Russia, and this is in 2014, right? That Russia is no friend to the US at that point. That equality does drive support, but we don't ask about it in these other issues that pick up on equity a little bit more. And so we'd have to think about that. My hunch is that there would be differences because I think that relationships and images and stereotypes and all these things matter quite a lot, but I'm not sure exactly in what direction. So this is a good path for more research on this.
Poor Sonia and Tim must be late there, and they look tired. They look like they're just pinning their eyes open. I know it's nice. I mean, Bill, he says it's nice where he is. It's certainly nice where I am. But we still have like 10 minutes. We don't have many questions, so maybe this will be it. Oh, we have 5 minutes here. So John Mueller, you're the only one I have with a hand up.
Okay, I'll try to be brief since we're in.
Okay.
The question is, suppose the people in the agreement have different values of the goal, the value of the goal. So if I reach an agreement with all my neighbors to put out Christmas tree lights one winter because it brightens the neighborhood, and I put out 7,000 lights and you put out 2, and then I complain to you because you're not burden sharing enough. And you say, screw you, 2 is great. You should get rid of this, 6,000 of yours. That, since we have the Germans involved here, is the NATO thing. The United States seems to think that the Soviet Union and now Russia is going to invade it every 15 minutes. And most of the Europeans are too smart to believe that. So therefore, they're willing to put something in, but they don't value the goal very much because in that case, the probability in their estimate is microscopic as opposed to what the Americans have said. And what they say is, okay, if you want to do 7,000 Christmas tree lights, in other words, spend $1 octillion, vastly more than anybody else in the world does on defense, that's your problem, not ours. So does that enter into the equality thing or equity thing?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, so in our case, like we aren't looking at necessarily the strategic interaction component of it. I do know that in some of my esteemed co-author Josh Kurtzer's work, he has done that. And he finds that it does matter quite a bit, right? If you have 2 people, both in his case just value sort of an abstract notion of fairness, they come into an agreement much more quickly than people who carry these different sort of value orientations, where they find that agreements are more likely to break down. So I think that's quite important. And I think that is probably perhaps what drives some of the disagreement about whether or not some of these policies are problematic. People come at them from different value orientations. And if you care about equity, but the person you're conversing with doesn't, it's going to be hard to sort of come to some sort of consensus about what the best approach is. So I think that's really important. And again, yeah, the strategic interaction component I think is really interesting.
Chris Duffy.
Hey, thanks very much. Really cool paper. Thank you, Katie, for a great presentation. A couple of questions. One is, I'm always fascinated by, and this may go back to Sarah's point about being obsessed with American politics. How can we not be obsessed with American politics today? But I'm always fascinated by anybody who shows something that has a bipartisan reach in the way that equity arguments do here. And so I'm wondering if you had thought about maybe in future studies, trying to look at using, using equity arguments basically as doing sort of studies of persuasion and what kinds of arguments could persuade people to change their mind, because so few people change their mind about anything anymore, it seems like. So, and in particular, so little conversation goes on across parties within foreign policy. If something like equity is a lens or a frame that makes certain kinds of messages persuasive to people, is that something that that would, you know, for example, get a Democrat to listen to Trump, or get, or you know, or vice versa, or whatever. Or even if somebody from your own party is making an argument, but they're not using that frame, they're not using an equity frame, they're using an equality frame, and you don't share it. Like, how does this intersect with that sort of persuasion in terms of moving the public to support your foreign policy? And then second question is, if I read figure, this is just a purely empirical question, figure 1, right, and I don't think you put this up in the slideshow, but it looks like women are have a stronger support for equity than men do.
And equality. They just care about fairness a lot more.
Okay, all right. So that's all right. And is that something that's like generalizably true about do you know if there's other, is that like a generalizable sort of gender pattern, or?
Yeah, part of the reason I don't talk about it much is because it's something that like we found and we think is interesting, and we sort of get into some of the gender gap stuff like at the end of the paper as differences in fairness values being a prospective mechanism for some of the gender gaps that we know about. But as far as this finding that women just like care about fairness a lot more than men, we didn't find a whole lot of that elsewhere in the literature. So I'm not totally sure how generalizable it is. And I feel like if it were, my co-author Deb Brooks would have known about it. So we don't go too much into it because we didn't have like super strong theoretical priors. Instead, we just sort of treated it as something we would explore. But if you have any suggestions for what we ought to think about with respect to that.
The thing that I would think about is it people from sort of say historically disadvantaged or disempowered groups who care more about fairness, because fairness is a lever to get an outcome that might be closer to what they want, as opposed to if you're from the privileged group, then fairness, you don't need fairness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, you do see these conversations in like the social justice world focusing on these different dimensions of fairness a lot. And so that strikes me as totally plausible. And I will have to read more to find out how true it is.
Trump's been talking a lot about, I thought at the end he said Americans supported free trade, not fair trade, but I think maybe he meant the opposite. Maybe I misheard you, because I think like with Trump, he's always talking about fair, not free trade. So, because
we looked at support for free trade in particular. Of course, I don't think when Trump says fair trade, he means that we ought to pay coffee growers more for their labor, right? I think he means that he doesn't see the system of tariffs as being fair to the United States, which would be consistent with our sort of equity-based argument.
Yeah, just that we shouldn't be competing with lower wage workers, because it isn't fair to American workers to compete with workers who don't have they don't have environmental protections, they don't make anything, and so I think that's what they're getting at, right?
That's not what we're getting at in this paper at all. We're asking people specifically about tariff reductions and whether or not we should.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying that you're missing, since your paper's about fairness, that's kind of the Trump narrative, right? Fair, not free trade.
Yeah, although again, I think my interpretation of that is that when he talks about fair trade, what he means is that if other countries are going to have sort of import tariffs on U.S. and on things that they're being bought from the U.S., then we ought to be able to do the same thing, rather than we should pay more for our coffee.
I don't think that's right. I mean, a little bit. There's a little bit of that, like that if you're going to subsidize your industries, and if you're going to, that is part of it. That is definitely the big part of it. But I think the people that support him say, we can't compete with people who don't have, that don't make anything, or, like, so there is a sense that that's putting America first, that, I don't care about raising them. I don't care about creating a middle class in China, Bannon used to say. I care about the middle class in the United States. I think that's what that's the vote he's going for. The people say, if free trade, if we make free trade agreements and they don't help our middle class or our workers, then he may be wrong. I'm not saying he's logically right, but if they don't help us, then we don't sign the agreement. That's what I think he means.
Right. Yeah. And again, I don't think we would object to that characterization. And our main finding is simply that, like, on the basis of equity, people are sort of objecting to these free trade agreements, and perhaps that's the rationale.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I'm not denying that what you're arguing. I'm just saying that there is the paper is very relevant in terms of, I think that a lot of voters and a lot of Republican voters feel, like Trump's, if you had to sum up on a bumper sticker, what does Trump think about foreign policy? It would simply read, the rest of the world is screwing the United States. That's it, That's all you have to know. He's been saying it for 30 years, the same thing. They're screwing us because we're just a bunch of chunks, or, saps, that's what we are. And that's what they mean. I think that's the mainlining that's going on with Trump and his voters. That's the whole America first,
Well, then I think the point in this goes back to the...
He's saying he's in favor of free trade. He's arguing that it's not free because people are cheating.
Right.
But he really wants it to be free and equal. That's what he says.
That's what he says. I know that's what he says. Yeah.
About 90%, almost 90% of both Democrats and Republicans think that trade is a good thing. International trade is a good thing.
Yeah.
I think because Republicans think Trump is in favor of free trade, and Democrats think he's against it. So therefore, they're both for it for different reasons.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
You rarely get 90% or 88% from both parties on these kinds of questions.
But I think this goes back to the question that Chris asked, and which I still want to answer, which is this question of, to what degree can like an equity-based framing of something like Trump's messaging on trade, or basically anything else in foreign policy, frankly, to what extent can that actually mobilize like a pretty broad swath of the American public, right? And our research would imply that it would be a thing that would resonate even without party members, even with Democrats. So, like, again, this is the notion that everybody thinks that America's getting screwed on NATO, even if, from a grand strategic perspective, like that's just not a fair characterization or an appropriate characterization. And so I do think there's a ton of room. I think I've been doing this work on like morality and foreign policy attitudes for a while. And I think we have a lot of pretty good evidence that's sort of correlational and survey based. But the evidence for like persuasive framings on these types of things is not as clear. It's something that I'm doing in some of my other current research, and hopefully I might be able to do with respect to some of this. Because Chris, I think you're right that that's a really good direction to go. And this also brings up Randy's point about like other types of fairness. I am definitely working on other types of fairness, including reciprocity and negative reciprocity and retribution. I've got some data that has yet to be analyzed, looking at different fairness-based frames for financial bailouts. So we have some cross-national data from the US and UK looking at like 5 different fairness-type frames to see what moves support for or opposition to some of these financial bailouts. So hopefully we'll have an answer to that question as soon as I actually open these data.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add this last thing. You'll all be able to go in a minute, but just to put a fine point on the Trump trade thing. Now I forgot it. Oh my gosh. Give me a second. Oh, it was a good point, but I can't remember it. That's what happens when you get old.
Katie, while Randy's thinking, this is
Yeah.
Rick again. Another hard context I'd love to see you test this is in people's attitudes about the structure of decision-making in the United Nations Security Council, and whether they think it's fair that France and Germany get a bigger say than Japan, Brazil, India, and I bet they do. That would be my guess. And I'm just wondering how far this equity goes when you get into harder choices for Americans.
That's a really interesting question, because first of all, I have to test that now because I think it's really important and salient. But my hunch, because whenever I teach like UN Security Council and structure to my intro IR students, they think it's terrifically unfair that Germany gets a bigger say.
Germany doesn't get a say.
Or sorry, not,
Germany doesn't have any say in security.
Sorry, they think it's terrifically unfair that Germany doesn't get a say, because they think of Germany as this like powerful, influential state now, and they're no longer the bad guys. And so they get outraged. They want Germany and Japan to have a voice on the UN Security Council, and they think that France and the UK really don't belong there. And so they actually tend to be pretty resistant to the current structure.
Oh, I do remember my point. It took me a long time. Trump seems to think that trade imbalances mean unfairness. And this is what all the liberals attack him for, that he doesn't understand trade. He doesn't understand, what the point of trade is. And so, again, this goes to your point. I think it's highlighting your point about how it's so difficult to figure out what is fair. And Trump supporters tend to say, oh, we have billions and billions of dollars. We have a $600 billion trade deficit with China. How can it be fair? How is this good for America? But what would be fair? Well, if we didn't have a trade imbalance. It's a very neo-mercantilist kind of logic, but I think it gets to your point about how do you measure fairness? Maybe he's not sophisticated. That's all. Maybe his followers are not sophisticated. But it is asking a lot of Americans. Don't you think it's asking a lot of Americans that they should understand that we have over a $500 billion trade deficit with China, but it could be fair? That's asking a lot. Don't you think, Bill? Don't you think that's asking a lot?
The concept, it's econ. I mean, middle school economics could teach that.
Well, how would you teach it to them? Tell me, how would you teach it to them?
My kids,
Comparative advantage.
My kids they had this in high school. I mean, the textbook covered it in plain language, no math. It's not that hard.
Doug Irwin has a very persuasive foreign affairs piece, Randy.
No, I think it's really hard.
If they can read foreign affairs, Doug Irwin's beautifully written, plain, stunning, lovely, simple English paper, then they should understand it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think you're asking way too much of them, but all right. If you think that that's asking nothing, okay. But all right. So I want to thank Kathleen or Katie for the great presentation, and Chris for the great discussion and everyone's input. And now I will close the conference. I was supposed to have some final thoughts. I kind of believed that I wouldn't have any final thoughts, and I don't. I just had a great time. That was tiring, of course, that you always feel washed out after a conference, but I guess that's the conference experience. But most important, I'm just glad I met so many of you that I didn't know before. I think it was a success.